Hello, listeners. Welcome to Debra and Peter are doing a podcast with me, Deborah Allcock-Tyler, and him, Peter Wanless, who I have to say, for those of you who are only on audio, Peter is wearing the most fabulous jacket today. It's purple with sort of pale pink and white flowers and a lovely purple, I think it's like a grandad neck shirt, isn't it? It looks amazing, Peter.
Oh, well, I feel the need to dress up for these occasions now after getting such lovely feedback on my shoes and shirt last week. I thought, well, let's go for a jacket this week, and who knows, maybe a hat next week. But this is a bit out there, isn't it? This jacket. It's one that I got given for a birthday, and I think I've worn it once or twice to the cricket. In fact, I wore it to Lord's, and the stewards, one of the stewards at Lord's, had a go at me for my rather lurid jacket, which, given that the MCC colours are those, those egg and bacon, red and yellow stripes, I thought, well, it's all very well for him to have a go at my floral jacket when the club colours are, I would say, more lurid and less tasteful than this particular jacket. But I had a slight crisis of conscience about wearing it out, and it's a very summery look, isn't it? I think I shall save it up, and I'll wear it to a more deserving cricket ground a little bit later in the summer.
Well, I think it's fantastic. It's an interesting thing because you and I have spoken about this before, but like the rules about male clothing, you're supposed to wear dark colours, navies and blacks and greys, and basically men are constrained to a uniform largely. And it drives me absolutely nuts. So I'm just so pleased that you're one of those chaps who are like, sod the conventions, I'm going to be bright and colourful. But it's interesting because I had a conversation with somebody about this a while ago, and they was basically saying something like how I tended to buck the trend in, how I appeared and things that I said and stuff. But then somebody else, and they were asking me how did I do it, and I was talking about bravery and courage, and somebody else said, no, it's privilege. You're at the top of your career. It's like you've achieved. You're not trying to impress anybody anymore. So you're in a privileged position of being able to do that. And I thought that's very true, actually.
Yes.
So I'm just really curious, Peter.
Yeah.
Was there a point at which you segued from like traditional civil servant, grey suit, white shirt, possibly a red tie if you were feeling adventurous or multicoloured, into these kind of outfits that you wear so well now?
So I've always tried to be a little bit different, and it wasn't too difficult to be rebellious in the civil service. So I would say back in my early civil service days, I was known for wearing quite bright ties, not luridly ridiculous ties, but nice looking ties. And then when I went to the lottery, it was all about the cufflinks. And I got quite a big collection of themed cufflinks of one sort or another. And when I had my interview for the NSPCC chief executive role, and I was interviewed by young people, they were extremely taken by my cufflinks because they thought they were interesting and a little bit different, but not too different, I think. The whole kind of very floral shirts and jackets and all the rest of it, that took off during lockdown when I almost created a rod for my own back with these sort of fundraisers to be wearing different lively clothes. And now I feel that I let people down if I'm dressed in sober outfits. So it's been a bit of a journey, but I've always tried to be a little bit different. I got telling off from a permanent secretary reasonably early on in my civil service career for attending a ministerial event with no jacket and with my sleeves rolled up. And I had no idea that was an offensive thing to do. And I don't think he particularly thought it was, but he felt he was giving me some careful advice about not causing unnecessary offence. And I still think it's not true that anything goes, is it? I would still, I think, suggest to people if they were going for an interview at an organisation where they weren't quite clear what the kind of culture and the expectations were, not necessarily to go all out there at the first step, and that's not about not being yourself, but it's just about not creating barriers for yourself or unnecessary distress or offense. If I were going for a new job, I wouldn't wear this jacket. Well, actually, I might do now because I'm known for them. So perhaps that is back to kind of privilege and creating the reputation. But yeah, I think there's two sides to every story, aren't there? And I think being respectful of the culture and the context around you, it's worth knowing that before you decide quite how rebellious you want to be or what version of yourself you turn up as. But maybe I'm pulling my punches there.
No, because I was just thinking about, like, because obviously you probably do too, and I do it, advise a lot of aspiring young leaders. And clothing's just a really interesting one, isn't it? Because, my line has always tended to be, don't wear something that's going to get in the way of you and your message and your presence. So, but on the other hand, there's also a part of me that thinks that actually, it's ridiculous that we have to conform. And the trouble is, when you conform, you then force other people to conform. It just becomes a whole thing of conforming to what are frankly ridiculous rules. On the other hand, I think my message to my team is, I used to be really strict about it. You were not allowed to wear jeans at DSC. You weren't allowed to wear trainers. You had to look as if you cared. I've relaxed quite a bit now, but I think the main message for me is that just look as if you care. If you're just wearing a scruffy old T-shirt, you haven't bothered, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
And I found it worse now online. Now people, because lots and lots and lots of our meetings and events happen online, people just seem to completely forget that I can see what you're wearing. I'm not just seeing you from the neck up, and it does. With the best in the world, it definitely does. What it gives for me is if someone's wearing an unironed T-shirt or just looking a bit disheveled, or if they haven't bothered, what it says, it's like subliminal messages that you don't care about your own personal presentation. How much do you care about the work or the conversation we're about to have, or how careful are you about, other things? And I think we just have to accept that's the reality of human beings. We will judge you. But I do think we should start moving away from the traditional notion of blokes in suits, because I don't approve of that. But I think a message to aspiring leaders in particular, by all means be adventurous, just look as if you care. Don't just turn up looking in any old thing, because it does matter.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And clothing and how you present yourself can be distracting from the message. And if the most important thing that you want to achieve from this meeting is to convey particular messages with real power, then don't distract from that by putting some other things in the way that could jeopardize your ability to achieve that. I remember one of our former trustees saying to me about one of our leading fundraisers, who was very talented at what he did. There's a lot to take in when he walks into the room, isn't there? And it was just this kind of combination of extremely sharp dress sense and a particular sort of look that, he wasn't saying any of it was wrong, but just, my goodness, there was a lot to kind of get your head round before you started talking about how we were going to protect children.
Funny enough, my sister's a bit like that. She's very famous for wearing incredibly bright colours and very unusual outfits and things like that. And mostly she looks amazing. Occasionally, and I say this to her face, she sort of has a bit of a Sue Pollard air about her, you know what I mean? She looks like a clown who got duffed up before they went into the, you know what I mean? She fell into a bag of old clothes. But mostly she looks amazing. But the interesting thing is, because she stands out so much, she's always remembered.
Yes.
Nobody ever forgets meeting my sister, precisely because part of this whole thing is this, my goodness, this vision walks into the room. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? But it just comes back to, just look as if you cared about your appearance, because then that will help people to take you more seriously. It's not about suits and ties or power suits or anything like that, but it is about, not letting things get in the way. Yeah, I think that's really true. Yeah, but it also just make me think about, the privilege of position. You and I can get away with saying all sorts of things on this podcast. We've said all sorts of things, probably, that many people, in an earlier part of their career would feel they didn't have the confidence to. And I'm never sure about whether, not sure what that means, other than we should keep speaking out and saying what we really believe, because we need to model so much better to be truthful and open and transparent and try not to worry too much about ego, what people say. But on the other hand, when you're, further down in your career, these things are much, much harder to do, aren't they? Because other people are judging you in a very different way. I mean, if people say horrible things about me, I'm not going to say I don't care. I always care if they say horrible things about me, but it doesn't really make any difference. It's like you say what you like, Whereas further down in your career, when people are dismissive of you or they make their comments about, oh, did you see what she was wearing? And of course, you won't get this so much, Peter, but this happens to women all the time. We are constantly judged on what we wear. Our skirts are too short or that outfit. And I do it myself. I'll sometimes be sat watching something and I'll be saying, oh, I wouldn't have worn that frock in that interview if I was that person. And my partner will say to me, Deborah, internalized misogyny, stop it. So it is, there's so many difficult things to navigate through life and in your careers. Now, I'm so glad I'm not at the beginning of my career, Peter, I tell you.
Yes. And talking of clothes, back end of last week, it was World Book Day, which involves lots of stress and strain in very many families as they come under immense pressure to dress their children up in the most extraordinary and amazing outfits to celebrate children's literature, but has also become a really successful day, I think, in the school calendar, both for celebrating reading and for raising money. And I wonder if you got any thoughts about that. I mean, I certainly remember someone having a go at me for what would it have been? So NSPCC runs Number Day, where kids can it's a way of celebrating maths but also raising money and teaching philanthropy. And some schools, you don't have to, but some schools encourage kids to come in with outfits with numbers on them. Lots of people come in with their football shirts, but someone had a go at me online about this was creating cost and pressure for families because all children were being made to dress up, and charities should kind of butt out of these sorts of days. Have you come across that before?
Well, I mean, certainly, I don't have kids myself, but obviously my family members do. And so I know a fair bit about the stresses of, oh my God, he just told me that it's World Book Day tomorrow and I hadn't, whatever. I think there's something problematic, because the problem is the person who suffers is the kids. And I know that certainly because I was a governor of a primary school, and days like that were quite problematic because there were some parents who were very committed to their school, to their kids, to their school's education, to whatever, kept on top of it all. And these kids would turn up in the most brilliant outfits.
Yes.
And then there were quite a lot of other kids whose parents weren't engaged, didn't particularly care, or were too busy, or something had happened, and these kids would turn up in much less outfits. And, sometimes there was a little bit of, because kids can be quite brutal towards one another, and sometimes, some of the kids would suffer. So for me, it's less about the pressure on the parents and more about the impact on the kids. Is that, the trouble with that sort of thing. And then there was also, I do remember there was one kid who turned up, I think it was a Spider-Man outfit or something, anyway, a cartoon character. And this child was basically being told, well, that's not, it was World Book Day, you're supposed to become as a character from a book. And I do remember intervening and saying, well, Spider-Man is a character from a book. He's a character from a comic book. And a comic book is a book. So actually, this outfit is absolutely fine. But there was quite a lot of that. And I think that there are some things that people love and get a great deal of pleasure out of that others don't. Like at DSC, for example, we used to, encourage our staff to do fancy dress when we had like all staff days and things like that. And then I discovered my staff absolutely loathed doing that. Not all of them. Some of them loved it and went all in, but a load of them were like really reluctant. And I must admit, I'm personally not a fan of fancy dress, particularly, or dressing up in that sort of way. So I think it's quite difficult. I think you're right. There is a sense of fun and creativity and celebration, but actually there's also kind of a downside to it, which is those people, both whether they're children or whether they're people in organisations who, for whatever reason, have neither the time, the headspace, the energy, or even the money to dress up and things. But we've done cheating things now at DSC. Like we'll do a thing like, say, wear a hat. Because hats most people can deal with. It's not a full-on dress. It's not a full-on outfit. It's not the full-on marks. But wear a funny hat or, wear a particular colour or something.
Well, certainly when it comes to Christmas jumper day, I have got probably about 50 Christmas jumpers and Christmas outfits now available to either auction, lend, or hire.
Yes.
to people. So don't feel like you're under pressure when it comes to Christmas jumper day. Just come to me, and I will make sure that you don't feel left out. I think with a lot of these school things, it comes down to
how it's managed.
Good planning and inclusive practice, doesn't it? And it's the surprise that
box in the school, for those kids who have, for whatever reason, not managed to deliver. Although I can tell you right now, Peter, I hate Christmas jumpers with every fibre of my being. You will never get me in one. In fact, I cheated when because we said Christmas jumpers at our staff day. Christmas thing, and I've got this tiny little knitted toy jumper.
Oh, I remember.
Which I pinned. Do you remember?
Yeah.
I think I showed it to you.
Yes. How miserable of you!
See, and then you get bullied and mocked if you don't want to play. Yeah. Anyway, talking of World Book Day, Peter, have you been reading anything interesting lately?
Yeah. So I have just finished the most incredible book. It's definitely one of the best books I've read in recent times, and it's not a new book, but I've got it here, and I just thought it was tremendous. It's called Hellhound on His Trail, and it's written by Hampton Sides, and it's an account of the assassination of Martin Luther King, and it cuts between the last days of Martin Luther King's life and the last days of James Earl Ray, who assassinated Martin Luther King, and the subsequent attempt to track him down and punish him for the crime. And it's absolutely thrilling, and as the author says at the end of the book, it's not a thrilling thing that Martin Luther King's life was taken in this desperately tragic way. So it's as much a requiem as a thriller, but the compelling narrative of these two lives as they come inevitably crashing together, and then the consequences of what happens subsequently is just, I love modern history, and I love thrillers, and I love true crime, and there's just so many dimensions to this book, and the way in which he writes is wonderful, that it's made me think I'm now going to read another book by Hampton Sides about a different bit of history that I'm not so interested in, and see if the quality and excitement of his writing can be translated into something that I'm not so kind of naturally interested in. But it's a great book, and highly recommended. Certainly, haven't been able to put it down this last few days.
We'll pop the name of the book and the author into the notes so that any listeners who want to follow up on that. But it's interesting, isn't it, how a powerfully written book can really have an impact on you and change your life. In fact, because when I was back in my, late 20s, I never really did science at school. My girl was an all-girls school, very, very small. They introduced sociology when I was in the sixth form, and the parents went mad. You know what I mean? It was like that sort of, it was ridiculous, so old. In fact, we did Latin and Greek, exactly. But so I was never particularly encouraged to do science. We had girls in our school who were interested in science and maths, but they were tiny. The rest of us were pushed down arts, literature, etc. But I'd always had a little bit of interest in it. But I also didn't like the practical side of it. I wasn't interested in chemistry experiments or, physics experiments.
Yeah.
But anyway, when I was in my 20s, my then chief exec was a chap called Tony Morgan. And he suggested I read a book by a chap called Fritjof Capra, called The Tao of Physics. Now, Fritjof Capra, I don't know if you've heard of him, Peter, but he's a theoretical physicist. But he also developed his interest in Eastern mystic religions, Taoism, that sort of thing. And so he wrote this book called The Tao of Physics, where he essentially was comparing the world of quantum physics largely to some of the stories and the mystic messages and all the rest of it in Eastern mystic religions. And it just blew my mind. But the bit of it that blew my mind was not the mystic religions, or the Eastern religions rather, it was the science that he wrote about. And it literally changed the course of my interests, of my, I then ever since then, I've been obsessed with maths books and physics books and, science books and chemistry and biology, mostly physics. That's, where my real passion lies. And that would never have happened. I would never have known that that was a part of me that was so desperate to learn and develop if he hadn't have given me that book. So there's something about giving somebody or coming across a book that can really profoundly do something important, isn't there?
And did you have time in your life and the headspace to appreciate it? Was that a particular moment in your life? Because I've wondered when I was reading this book, would I have been so compelled by it in the middle of last year when I had 1,001 NSPCC issues and challenges to be thinking about? And I'm not sure I would. I mean, one of the other amazing things about this book is it's incredibly short chapters and chunks and this sort of thing. So you could read 3 or 4 short bits just before you go to sleep every night and keep it going. But I've certainly read an awful lot more books and more quotes difficult unquote books since stopping full-time work, just because I've got this space in my head to appreciate.
Well, possibly, but reading is one of my addictions, Peter. I mean, I've been brought up in a family of prolific readers. My grandmother was, always had books on the go. And so I've always got a book on the go. My team at DSC I'm always saying, I've just read this brilliant book or, whatever. So possibly not because I'm just so interested in reading it. Always got a book on the go. Read on the train, read in the bath, read when I nip to the loo, all the places that, even when I was at work, I would never go to the toilet without taking a book with me, in the workplace. So I could have a quick catch up on a chapter or a few paragraphs. So I've always read prolifically. So I'm not sure. And I think some people are just readers and some people are less inclined to that. But I also think that a lot of our fellows, chief execs particularly, and well, not just anybody in the sector, I think they're missing a massive trick if they don't read, because I've discovered that it doesn't even matter if I'm non-fiction, most of the things you read, you'll be learning something that's actually helpful in life. It's like I'm working my way through The Turkish Detective at the moment by Barbara Nadell, which is a whole series of books, which I'm furious because I'm one of those people. I have to, if someone recommends a book, I've got to find the first book in the series and I've got to work my way through. I can't just pick up one in the middle. And of course, Mama said, you must read The Turkish Detective. So I did, only to discover to my horror, there are 27 books. And so that's all I've been reading for about the last 6 weeks is these bloody books. And I've still got 3 to go. And I'm like, I'm getting sick of them, but I've got to get to the end. Actually, I'm not. They're very well written. But anyway, but even in these Turkish detective stories, I'm learning an awful lot. So it's making me think that's a really interesting perspective. So I would say, and then people who say like, I don't read, I don't like reading, I haven't got time to read. I'm like, well, audiobooks then. If you're not wanting to listen to a book, listen to an audiobook, but like constantly. And I actually would say that to leaders generally. If you want to be the best leader you can possibly be, you're not going to be able to do that unless you are reading and learning and finding new sources of information and inspiration. If you just think my job is just to turn up, lead my team, do the budget, do the strategy, meet a few donors, you'll probably be okay, but you're not going to be a brilliant leader. Brilliant leaders are always looking outside of the job to where else they can learn from, I think.
I think these days as well, if you can train yourself to concentrate on something for longer than a couple of minutes. So much of the reading we do now is short newspaper articles, tweets, little snippets of this, that, and the other, actually to train and remind your mind that getting deep learning and understanding and concentration for a sustained period of time on something, it almost doesn't matter what it is, helps prevent that kind of very short-term reactive living in the moment, reacting and responding to the last thing you've heard or the last person you've spoken to. That's another really important, I think, case for reading.
Yeah, because it's interesting how many people don't even read around their own professional expertise. Like, marketeers who don't read Marketing Week, for example, or, do you know what I mean? It's like, I find it super, or people who work in our sector who don't read our sector stuff, like, Civil Society News or Third Sector, any of those. Again, I always find that a real puzzle, that why would you not be reading around the thing that you're engaged in? But,
I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something that I've never really read a great deal of. and I hesitate to say this to you because you've written some of them and I have read your book, but leadership books.
Yeah.
So I do and have struggled with the theory of leadership, with some notable exceptions, because I kind of felt that I've been living leadership in many and varied ways, and I've got all these kind of issues and examples from my own life that I would have to plead guilty if someone asked me, to what extent have you read around leadership? I don't mind talking about it and hearing from people who've read those sort of books and want to provoke, but that's a topic which I would much rather talk about, I think, than shut myself away and theorize over. So I'm not quite sure what that's about.
Well, I have to say, I empathise with you. I have read quite a lot of leadership books, particularly early in my career, because that was my job, training and developing leadership. And you have to read around it when you teach people how to do it. But I don't like them either. But one of the reasons I'm not a fan of them, and I hope mine is slightly different because of this, is how unrealistic they are. It's like, it's just so like, here's the theory, do this, do that, do the other, and it'll work. And but it doesn't. That's the trouble. There's real life and real human beings, and human beings don't behave rationally, and they certainly don't. You can be really walk into the office one morning and say hi everybody, and you get hi back, and you walk in and say exactly the same next day, and you go it's like there's no. So I think I hate the simplicity of so I hope my books are a bit more full of honesty and failure and how human beings are, and more practical tips like, look, try this. It might not work, but it might, as opposed to some of those which are about very simple models of, assuming. It's the same with economists, isn't it? One of the reasons why economics and people who are professionally trained in economics get it so horribly wrong is because most of them don't take into account human nature. They assume that people will do what's in their rational best interest. And in my experience, almost nobody does what's in their rational best interest, for a million and one reasons. That's why, have you read Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow?
No.
Oh, he's fantastic. He actually won, I think he won a Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's a psychologist. It may have been a Nobel Prize. Anyway, it's some big prize. What he basically did was he applied the psychology of human beings to how we make decisions, which is effectively what economics is largely about. It's about, decision making, isn't it? It's absolutely brilliant and eye-opening, Peter, about how little we know about ourselves. And that he has two systems, the thinking fast, thinking slow, and that we have the slower system where we really take time to look at the detail and all the rest of it, and then the very quick system. But most of us rely on the quick system.
Yes.
That's how we survive. You walk into a room, you see the expressions on the faces, you instantly make a decision about, and you move on. And that's where prejudice comes from. That's where, but also good things. He's not saying that one system's better than the other. He's just pointing out that and how we rationalize. It's absolutely brilliant. So again, we'll put the information about the book in the links, but really, really eye-opening. So I do love books like that. I love books because his book isn't about leadership, it's about the psychology of decision-making, really. But he, as I said, he won I think it was a Nobel in economics because of the quality of the writing, how it linked to decision-making in economics. So anyway, there you go. Books, 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 books. That's the main message of this podcast so far, isn't it? Read, get reading. Yeah, so interesting. I've been thinking as well, actually, about messaging generally, messaging. And again, once again, disappointingly, is another negative message out of this Labour government. This one being about the benefit system is broken, which it probably is. But the framing of it is so much, the messaging is so much that there are these lazy scroungers hanging around doing nothing, taking advantage of, I've got a bit of a headache, I'm going to claim disability benefits. I mean, I will say it's not actually that easy to. I'm disabled myself, as you know. I have real mobility issues, and I can't even get a bloody parking badge. It's like the hoops and loops you have to go through even to get that. And that's not a benefit in the same way. So I just have a real question about it, really. And I think, again, this kind of assumption that some people are scamming the system. And I sometimes wonder, does our desperation to avoid the relatively small number of people who are taking the piss end up costing us more than just saying, in this system, some people are going to take the piss, let's just live with it? Do you know what I mean? I just wonder if we spend too much on tracking down one or two errant individuals. Anyway, I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I heard a really interesting talk from Paul Johnson just left the IFS, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Former colleague of mine back in the days
And
in the Department for Education.
Former boss of my Harry, Peter. He worked before he came to us at DSC, yes.
Right, okay. Well, I've got a lot of time for Paul, and I think it was a New Philanthropy Capital conference. Yes, it was. It was Dan Corrie's farewell conference for the New Philanthropy Capital, and Paul Johnson gave one of his kind of state of the nation descriptions of the public finances, and he presented some figures which were extraordinarily shocking about both the scale of out of work disability broadly defined benefits in the UK relative to other European countries, and the pace at which that bill was accelerating and projected to accelerate. And the numbers were eye-watering and went way beyond what was happening in other countries. So for sure, there are some really difficult devastating mental health and well-being consequences of rising levels of poverty, ill health from COVID, hangover, and these sorts of things, which might lead you to expect that bill to be rising. But the pace it was rising at just felt wrong, I would say, just looking at the numbers, and well worth kind of digging under the skin of. And also, I do sympathise with the thought that paying that much money out to people not to be working, as opposed to be helping them into work. And one of the great injustices, not just in this country, but in other countries too, is our inability to create career paths for neurodiverse individuals. And I think if we could pivot or repurpose the benefits budget to help employers and employees get work that suits their particular ways of thinking, that would be excellent for those people and excellent for our economy. So I think there's there are some interesting and puzzling things going on, and we talked last week about you've got to spend money somewhere, you've got to cut money from somewhere else. And I think just by looking at the numbers, you can't avoid interrogating the scale and the pace of out of work benefits, but I can't pretend to know what's going on. But I think there's something bigger there than a few people claiming what they shouldn't be getting.
Well, because it's interesting you say that, because if you think about COVID, though, so if you think about those figures, which I'm not disputing, we probably are spending more, but we were one of the worst sufferers of COVID. I think there's something like 5% higher incidences of COVID rates than anybody else. I'm just trying to see if I can find some numbers here, which was worse than most of Europe, not quite as bad as the US, but and lower than Italy. We had a massive death toll. Like, I don't remember when we had the daily updates in the tables and we were looking at where we compared to other countries, and our death tolls were considerably higher than most other countries in the UK. So people were genuinely sick. Also long COVID, which nobody talks about. I mean, I know a few people, one of my friends has a congenital heart decision, which is developed as a side effect of COVID. And so I know some people who have, and it's clearly genuine. These are not people faking these conditions. So I think we also have to put that in context. We're probably spending more since COVID because we suffered more during COVID. And then if you think about things like depression, anxiety, mental health challenges, our economy suffered worse than most because we had such an erratic close down, open up, approach to how we manage the thing. And so our economy massively suffered. Then you add, so people lost their jobs, they lost their businesses, they got into debt, which does affect your mental and your physical health. And then on top of that, we had Brexit, where the economy was like massively negatively affected by Brexit. And those of you who have supported Brexit, by all means, write in and tell me I'm wrong, but I'm going to ignore you because I'm not, and I know I'm not. So there's a genuine illness here. That's the point I'm making. This hasn't gone up because people are now suddenly skiving. It's gone up because there was genuine illness. We've spoken about this before, and I was talking about spend on the NHS, and I was saying that we talk about the cost of the NHS like it's a cost, that's a negative thing rather than an investment. And the reality is that one of the reasons why we have so many older people living with longer term conditions, and the proportion is getting longer, is because the NHS is really successful, because that investment in people's health is actually resulting in people living longer, and people living longer with conditions that they otherwise wouldn't have, which need support and medication, things like that. So I still think we need to shift our thinking a little bit about seeing everything as a negative cost, rather than framing the taxes we pay to our government. The way I see it is, I'm giving you my money to invest in health, to invest in education, to invest in employment, to invest in the future of people, rather than it's a cost, it's a big cost. And I think if we could start to reframe the conversation, we might have more creative ways of making sure that money is spent really well. And then the thing about waste, there is always waste. I mean, my organisation, DSC, is absolutely tiny. We live on a shoestring. We've got no offices. We didn't have a pay rise this year. We literally are counting every penny. And yet there's still probably waste in my organisation. It's almost impossible to completely avoid waste. So I just think the narrative is a little bit wrong. We need to turn it around to say, are we getting the most for our money, rather than it's costing us too much? Because too much relative to what? Too much relative to the number of genuinely ill people in the country. Like, nobody talks about that. Nobody says there are 1 million people on benefits, 980,000 of them are faking it. And here's how we know. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's just framed as a number without any context or depth to it, which is why I think you're right about saying we need to dig deeper into these things. There you go. That's my thought for the day.
Well, there's so much I could come back to there. Some really big questions for the future. But I think we're out of time. We've rabbited and rattled on about little things, and then culminated in some really big questions, which we haven't got time to answer. And even if I had the answer, it's going to have to wait till next week, I think.
Yes, it will, Peter. But good fun. We started off the podcast listeners thinking, right, what are we going to talk about? And then, as is typical with Peter and I, suddenly we're off, like horses in the Grand National, which I also disapprove of. That's another story.
Right. Okay. I'm going to Cheltenham Gold Cup on Friday, so we can talk about horses. Next week, we're going to talk about horses.
Okay, we will talk about horses next week. Let's write it down, though, Peter, because you and I are now of an age where we can't bloody remember a thing that we said. Anyway, thank you for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Yeah. Bye.